It's insidious in its simplicity. A carefully worded tweet, a viral chain message on WhatsApp or Telegram, a screenshot of an article whose veracity we're too busy to check. Russian propaganda is everywhere, and the floodgates are not closing anytime soon. Although traditionally focused on the West, with the goal of undermining trust in democratic institutions, leaders, and processes, Russian propaganda is now spreading through Africa at an alarming rate with devastating consequences. In the United Nations General Assembly, for example, we've seen a notable lack of African nations voting to condemn Moscow's colonial war in Ukraine. This despite African states making up the largest voting bloc. Yet Russia's ambitions for Africa are not limited to gaining allies at the UN to legitimize its European war. In Africa, Russia sees a golden opportunity to skirt Western sanctions, limit Western access to Africa's vital resources, and buttress a workforce that has been decimated by the Ukraine conflict and shifting demographics. In Africa, Russia can counter decades of US military planning by removing pieces from the board that the West would have relied on should a global war break out. All this with the approval of a population taught to see friends in Moscow and enemies in Mississippi. In his 1878 travelogue, Henry Morgan Stanley named Africa the Dark Continent because of how little the world knew about it. Nearly 2.5 centuries later, despite the proliferation of the internet and the ease of international travel, it sometimes still feels like Africa is a dark continent. In international media, stories from Africa rarely get as much attention as stories from other parts of the world. Despite starting earlier and having a greater number of fatalities in a shorter time, the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia received a fraction of the coverage that the Ukraine-Russia war has. Sudan is in the grips of the worst humanitarian crisis in recent history, and it's barely a blip on the international stage. We don't bring this up to suggest that there's a proper amount of media coverage for a conflict to receive, but rather to highlight a feeling in the West that what happens in Africa has little bearing on the wider world. And it is a feeling that Africans are distinctly aware of. Writing for the Atlantic Council, Grant Harris, former Special Assistant to US President and Senior Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council, made the same observation, adding that a reassessment of Africa's strategic importance is past due. To begin that reassessment, we need to do something that Russia has successfully mastered. We need to stop treating Africa as a monolith. Africa is the second largest continent, with issues as diverse as the number of spoken languages. What makes Russia's propaganda in Africa so successful is its ability to speak to those local issues while finding a way to blame the West and absolve themselves of any culpability. The epicenter of all of this? The African Initiative. Hiding behind an innocuous name, the African Initiative is a news agency that describes itself as a platform to build bridges between Russia and Africa. It runs a website, RusAfro, with stories available in Russian as well as some of the major languages spoken in Africa: English, Afrikaans, Arabic, French, and Portuguese. The agency also controls a network of social media accounts primarily on the messaging platform Telegram, through which it disseminates content. Despite their seemingly benevolent goal, the African Digital Democracy Observatory, a network of independent research think tanks and investigative watchdogs that guard against the digital subversion of African democracies, has proclaimed the African Initiative, quote, Russia's mouthpiece in Africa. And they aren't the only ones who think so. In February 2024, the ADDO, the US State Department, and the independent Russian investigative outlet The Insider separately published exposés on the African Initiative, which, when taken collectively, provide crucial insights into the people, methods, and thinking behind Russia's propaganda campaign in Africa. The man behind the curtain is Artem Sergeyevich Kureev, a veteran of the FSB's Fifth Service responsible for foreign relations and a crucial part of Russia's influence campaign in Europe. Kureev launched the African Initiative in October 2023, 2 months after former Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin's death. The timing is essential because Prigozhin had established a network of social media accounts flooding African countries with content favorable to the Wagner Group and, by extension, Russia. Like with all of Prigozhin's other assets, the Kremlin was desperate to bring this network under its control. If Kureev's name sounds familiar to you, that's because he was recently in the news as part of a larger investigation into Tatiana Ždanoka, a Latvian politician and former member of the European Parliament. Now, while we won't go into the full details of that scandal in this video, here's the TLDR version. According to The Insider, Tatiana has allegedly been a Russian agent since at least 2004, alongside a mountain of evidence including emails and the names of her handlers, Dmitry Glade and Sergei Beltakov. The Insider pointed to the fact that she was one of 13 MEPs who voted against condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The insider further alleges that in 2014, mere weeks after Russia invaded Crimea, she helped Kureev secure a Schengen visa for a visit to the European Parliament. While ultimately a small part of Kureev's life, we highlight this incident to showcase his value to the FSB. His work was so vital to the Kremlin's goals that they were willing to use one of their best-placed assets, opening her up to scrutiny in the process, to secure his passage through the continent. This is at a time when Russia was cementing its place as a pariah state and was desperate for friends. According to Bloomberg, Kureev has frequently contacted European journalists, arranged and covered travel costs for some of them to visit occupied territories in Ukraine. He sometimes appears to have offered payment for planted news articles. Kureev is also capable of more subtle tactics to influence coverage, such as arranging interviews, flagging and debating topics in the news, or organizing press events. It is these skills, honed throughout a lifetime of intelligence work, that Kureev has directed towards Africa. Speaking to the Russian agricultural outlet Village Life, Kureev identified what he considered a key pillar to the success of the African initiative: recruiting African students studying in Russia to serve as journalists once they returned to their home countries. To that end, he also met with African students' clubs at Moscow's MGIMO University and Moscow State University. While the success of this recruitment drive is unclear, we must recognize why it might succeed. A job offer from an international firm that guarantees a salary, benefits, and a platform to showcase their work is very attractive to African students unsure of the economic realities back home. If these students accept Kureev's offer, they will follow in the footsteps of students who studied in the Soviet Union and are now the loudest voices pushing for closer ties between Africa and Moscow. Some of them run business and culture clubs that have been instrumental in creating grassroots support for Russia. In 2024, during the first ministerial conference at the Russia-Africa Partnership Forum, Russia announced plans to increase the number of scholarships allocated to African students. In light of Kureev's statements, we'll let you decide whether this is a coincidence. Kureev hasn't limited his recruitment to students. His highest profile hire was Viktor Vasilyev, real name Viktor Lukavenko, a former member of Prigozhin's propaganda network who served 5 years of an 8-year prison sentence for a racially motivated murder. Viktor styles himself as one of the leading Russian voices in West Africa and has amassed a following by posting his travels through the continent. In April 2024, he posted on Telegram announcing the formation of the African Initiative Association, a pro-Russian civil society organization based in Burkina Faso. The association organizes Russian movie screenings and sports tournaments where the Russian anthem is played before every match. It also runs a Telegram channel to promote its events and content, which has been signal boosted by Smile and Wave, Lukavenko's personal channel, and the official Africa Initiative channel. At this point, I need to make a quick confession. So far, we've failed to do something that we asked of you earlier. We have, with very few exceptions, treated Africa as a monolith and assumed that Russia is blanketing all 54 countries with the same message. America and the West bad, Russia good. And it kind of was necessary to get us to this point. But now that we've assembled some key pieces, let's take a page from Russia's playbook. We're going to fly across Africa to 4 countries: Kenya, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Egypt, where Russia's influence has been most prevalent. We will examine why these countries matter, the exact measures that Moscow has taken, their success, and the cost to both the West and the countries themselves. Described by Al Jazeera as Russia's Africa lab, the landlocked West African nation of Burkina Faso is where the Kremlin has perfected its Africa strategy. In 2022, Burkina Faso was the epitome of instability. The government of then President Kabore survived an attempted coup on January the 11th, only to fall 2 weeks later on January the 23rd to a coup led by Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. Damiba's government would fall 8 months later to an Ibrahim Traore-led coup. A common through line connecting both coups was a general dissatisfaction with the government's, and by extension, former colonial master France's, inability to stem the violence from an ongoing jihadi insurgency, which we covered in a past episode. During the coup that brought Damiba to power, a Reuters reporter saw Russian flags dotting the crowd, and many protesters urged the new government to replace Paris with Moscow as a strategic security partner. Quoting one of the protesters, "Today the Burkinabe people are asking for Russia's support to accompany them in this fierce struggle that has been imposed upon us." When Damiba took control of the government, he promised to improve the nation's security and defeat the jihadists. However, this proved easier said than done. His allies pushed for closer security collaboration with Russia, as France wouldn't provide them with military equipment to fight the jihadists. However, according to one Western official based in the Sahel, Damiba decided against allying with Moscow. The dissatisfaction with Damiba's handling of the jihadis was loudest on social media, creating a permissive environment for Traore's takeover. Within hours of the coup, Yevgeny Prigozhin posted on his Telegram channel praising Traore and his camp for doing what was necessary. Sergei Markov, a former Kremlin advisor, was more forthright, saying, "Our people helped the new leader of Burkina Faso." When Traore took power, he accused the French of aiding Damiba. Despite Paris's strenuous denials, the seeds planted during the first coup had already taken root. Traore's message went viral, and protesters, some waving Russian flags, they lit fires, they tore down barbed wire fences and threw stones at the French embassy in Ouagadougou. In the country's second-largest city, Bobo Dioulasso, anti-French protesters burned down the gates of a French cultural centre. The message was clear: we want Russia. Speaking to the BBC, Dr. Samuel Ramani, a geopolitical analyst at the Royal United Services Institute, said, in previous coups, Russia has tried to position itself as an accidental beneficiary of regime changes. This time around, Russia is a lot more proactive in support of the coup. If Dr. Ramani is right, then Russia propaganda has already scored its first win, engineering a coup that placed a Russia-philic leader in office. The rewards have been immediate. In 2024, Ouagadougou granted a gold mining license to Norgold, owned by Alexei Mordashov, a close Putin ally. He controls 4 of the country's 17 gold mines. Alexei hasn't been the only beneficiary. Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo, in a meeting with former US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, accused Burkina Faso of hiring the Wagner Group in exchange for a mine in the country's southern edge. Until very recently, most analysts considered Niger a committed ally to the West. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the US turned to the Sahel, realizing that the region's vast, sparsely populated desert and porous borders were an ideal incubator for new terrorist groups. Niger was a willing partner to Washington's Pan-Sahel initiative, helping in detecting and responding to suspicious movements of people and goods across and within their borders. In 2013, President Obama authorized the deployment of 100 US troops to Niger for intelligence collection. In 2016, the US invested further in Niger, announcing the construction of a drone base in the city of Agadez, which would eventually house over 1,000 troops. This military cooperation was remarkably successful, with Niger experiencing fewer terrorist attacks than neighbors Mali or Burkina Faso. Additionally, the US spent nearly $1 billion helping to provide a wide range of assistance, from military training to healthcare and clean water. When Mali's junta kicked out the French, the Nigerian government welcomed them with open arms, becoming the new hub for France's Sahelian anti-jihadist operation. Yet beneath this seemingly stable partnership lay deep-seated grievances. For decades, France had extracted uranium from Niger, fueling the 56 nuclear reactors that provide more than 70% of France's energy. In 2022 alone, France imported 1,440 tons of uranium from Niger, about 20% of its total uranium imports. However, this extensive mining operation had failed to boost the Nigerian economy, as is often the case with raw material mining without local processing. As Gilles Yabi, CEO of the West African Citizen think tank, observed in a piece for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, there was a stark irony in Niger supplying France with uranium to power its nuclear plants, while less than 20% of Niger's own population had access to electricity. This disparity, combined with decades of anti-colonial sentiments, created fertile ground for dissent. According to Olayinka Ajalia, senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Leeds Beckett University, these frustrations had deeply permeated the military. Writing for Foreign Policy, he explained that the Nigerian military did not appreciate the large number of foreign military troops and bases in the country, viewing them as undermining their authority. So, how does a country go from dancing the waltz with Washington to doing the Cameron Scar with the Kremlin? And the answer to that is a military coup. According to the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, a US Department of Defense institution, pro-Russia Telegram channels identified Niger as a future target following the 2022 Burkina Faso coup. Their influence quickly spread through Niamey through highly sophisticated and coordinated social media campaigns. On July 26, 2023, the fifth coup in the country's history deposed President Mohamed Bazoum, bringing General Abdurrahmane Tchani to power. Like Burkina Faso, journalists reported seeing Russian flags in the crowd as people demonstrated in support of the coup. On Telegram, Prigozhin described it as a moment of long overdue liberation from Western colonizers. Prigozhin's framing is important because it reveals why Russian propaganda has succeeded in West Africa. Moscow has successfully tapped into decades of anti-colonial sentiment against the French, sentiment that Paris itself fueled by treating its African partners as its juniors, amplified it, and then helped solidify the feelings that actions such as military deployment are akin to modern-day colonialism. You won't be surprised to hear that once the military came to power, they revoked key security partnerships with France, asked the French to leave, and turned to Russia as their key security partner. With France out of the way, Russia turned its sights on Niger's last remaining Western partner, the US. According to AFRICOM, the US African Command, Russia launched a coordinated disinformation campaign that led to the expulsion of American troops from Niger and the loss of the Agadez drone base. The campaign was so thorough and effective that General Michael Langley, the head of AFRICOM, said the following to the House Armed Services Committee, quote, "The Russian Federation had their playbook. They had their passing game through their disinformation. That's why I've asked for more capabilities in the State Department from the Global Engagement Center and also in our information operations in the military. We need to take the disinformation campaign. We need to hit it front and center." End quote. In 2024, Niger revoked the operating license of Orano, the French state nuclear company, cutting France off from accessing Nigerian uranium. Al Jazeera's Ahmed Idris reported that Russian companies were lining up to take over the mines from Orano. And the biggest customer? The EU. In a situation that the BBC described as politically awkward, EU imports of uranium from Russia rose by more than 70% despite the heavy sanctions imposed on Moscow. And if you're keeping score here, that would make it Russia 2, the West 0. While West Africa has been an outright success for Russia, Moscow is struggling to replicate this on the continent's east coast. In Kenya, the continent's seventh largest economy, Russian propaganda has found a willing audience, but has struggled to create a message compelling enough to fully exploit it. In Burkina Faso and Niger, Russia could take advantage of a history of military coups and anti-colonial sentiments against the French. None of that exists in Kenya. Kenya, a former British colony, has deep cultural ties to the Anglophone West and takes pride in being the ancestral homeland of former President Obama. It's a feeling the West has tried to reciprocate. In 2024, the US designated Kenya a major non-NATO ally, the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to receive the honor, recognizing the long-standing security ties between the two countries. So, how does Russia influence a country with such deep ties to the West? James Carville, Bill Clinton's political advisor, said it best. It's the economy, stupid. In 2022, Kenyans went to the polls in the midst of a cost of living crisis. The prices of fuel and food were particularly thorny issues as the world grappled with the fallout of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In this heated environment, Dmitry Maximyachev, Russia's then ambassador to Kenya, offered a rare interview to Kenya's biggest newspaper, The Nation. Although the interview touched on a wide range of issues, including Russia's past and present ties with Kenya, all of the headlines focused on one thing: Maximyachev's insistence that the West was responsible for the high prices of fuel, cooking gas, and wheat products. Russia has used this tactic multiple times in the past, legitimizing propaganda through a country's mainstream media. In countries like Kenya, where trust in the media is high, according to the Reuters Institute, 64% of Kenyans trust the media in general, while a staggering 91% trust the nation, this strategy can be very effective. It presents Russian propaganda on a level similar to legitimate news, asking the audience to view them as equals. While it's difficult to quantify the impact of this interview, high fuel prices linked to the Russia-Ukraine war remained a significant talking point even after the elections. In 2023, President William Ruto, the winner of the 2022 elections, cited the war as a major influence on Kenya's high cost of living. But mainstream media is not the only tool in the Kremlin's arsenal. Ironically, writing for The Nation, digital researcher William Kennedy noted that in 2022, Moscow successfully got Kenyans on Twitter to use the hashtags I stand with Putin and I stand with Russia on mundane, everyday posts. For weeks, the hashtags trended heavily, making it seem like Russia had broad popular support for its invasion. At the moment, Kenya's foreign policy ties it deeply to the West, but as we've seen in Niger, it only takes a moment to undo decades of geopolitical friendship. In our final case study, we head to Egypt, where Russia has been blatant in its propaganda in an effort to make Egypt the linchpin of its new Cold War with the West. Egypt's strategic importance to Russia is not a new phenomenon. From 1955 to 1967, the Soviet Union leveraged Egypt as a strategic entry point into the Middle East and North Africa region, capitalizing on Egypt's need to cover the military and developmental aid denied by the West in times of crisis. After the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Egypt leaned away from the USSR into Uncle Sam's embrace, becoming an anchor for US policy and enjoying extensive US assistance, totaling $1.3 billion in 2024 alone. Egypt is such a crucial part of US plans that when President Trump assumed office in January 2025, his foreign aid pause only made exceptions for two countries, Israel and Egypt. Dollars, however, don't paint the whole picture here. During the Obama era, Egypt's failure to transition to democracy and subsequent spiral into authoritarianism prompted the United States to reconsider the strategic logic of the country's relationship. That strain encouraged President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to turn to Russia, positioning it as an alternative source of economic and military collaboration. Writing for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Middle East fellows Amar Hamzawi and Rain G noted that Russia was actively filling the vacuum left by Western powers. Between 2016 and 2021, Russia was the largest arms exporter to Egypt, replacing the US. This increased military collaboration was coupled with increased Russian propaganda. In 2018, Al-Ahram, Egypt's oldest news outlet and the Middle East news agency, signed an agreement with Russian officials to develop cooperation and expand media broadcasting across Egypt and Russia. And as we mentioned previously, Russia's quite willing to co-opt local mainstream outlets to help it spread its message. The agreement was an omen of things to come, as RT Arabic, a subsidiary of the Russian state-owned network, banned in the EU, exploded in popularity in Egypt. It became the most visited news site in the country, second only to Yom 7, a semi-official news site that frequently reposts Russian media. In 2023, borrowing from its Kenyan playbook, Moscow blamed the West for Egypt's cost of living crisis. The message, amplified by Egyptian state media, was simple and effective. By trying to punish Russia with sanctions, the West was actually punishing poorer countries by making the price of basic goods like bread unaffordable. Bread is one of, if not the most important item in an Egyptian's shopping basket. Bread, freedom, social justice was the main chant of Egypt's 2011 revolution, which ousted the late President Hosni Mubarak. As one of the world's top wheat importers, Egypt suffered greatly because of the grain shortage caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. By putting out this message and laundering it through Egyptian state media, Russia sought to directly link the West to the higher prices ordinary Egyptians were paying. And the West couldn't take this lying down. The US, along with several European countries, put out a statement denouncing, quote, Russia's continuous use of disinformation campaigns and the, quoting again, attempt to shift blame for the repercussions of the war to others, including through public diplomacy. The State Department also sponsored a delegation of Egyptian journalists and news editors for an international visitor leadership program titled Countering Foreign Disinformation for Egypt. While these are steps in the right direction, we have to wonder what impact they will have at a time when Russia has co-opted the media. We are reminded of this popular thought experiment. If a tree falls in the forest with no one to hear it, does it make a sound? Across these countries, we have seen the ruthless efficiency of Russia's propaganda machine. Moscow has adapted its message to exploit local grievances, anti-colonial sentiments in the Sahel, and economic anxieties in East Africa, while maintaining a consistent narrative that paints the West as the enemy. Russia isn't just fighting a propaganda war in Africa, it's winning it. It comes at the worst possible time for the West. Trump's ascension to power and subsequent decision to shutter US aid has put the lives of millions in Africa at risk. It also cedes US soft power, creating a vacuum that other players are only too eager to fill. In 2014, The Onion posted a satirical article with the headline, CIA uncovers Chinese plot to just sit back and enjoy collapse of the United States. This headline now almost feels like a prophecy. While the US might not collapse, Western influence in Africa is already in freefall. The stakes can be higher. Africa's strategic importance extends far beyond its voting bloc at the UN or its vast mineral resources. If nothing changes, the West will lose two things. One, the battle for African hearts and minds, and two, the foundation for a stable, democratic world order that has underpinned global prosperity for generations. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its bloody shoes. At a time of shifting allegiances and increasing global conflict, the West cannot afford to be caught with unlaced boots, watching helplessly as its enemies sprint for the finish line. Thank you for watching.